Welcome everybody to our 6th talkBD event in our COVID-19 series. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. Thank you to everybody who's been able to join us and is on the line. Let's start with some introductions. You can see that there are 3 of us from the talkBD team joining you today. I am Erin Michalak. I'm a professor in the psychiatry department at the University of British Columbia, although we were trying to work out the dates before we started this webinar for how long we've been at home. We know that it's been 2 months that we've been holding these talkBD series, and I think it's about 9 weeks that I've been here on the Sunshine Coast where I live in British Columbia in a small village called Roberts Creek. And we've been working hard through that period, but we've also been doing lots of stuff to stay well and to try and maintain balance. One of the things I've been doing over the last couple of days is spending a lot of time peeling at my garlic. We've had wonderful weather here. It's been raining a lot at night and then really sunny in the daytime. And it's the time of year when the scapes come up off the garlic. The scape is like the seed head. Have you seen those at the farmer's market? And then you can kind of snip them off and eat them. And it's a very exciting time of the year when those are coming through. So it's one of the things I've been doing for myself. It's nothing to do with work recently. Victoria, glad you can join us. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Erin. My name's Victoria Maxwell. I'm a peer researcher and founding member with CREST. Started, I guess, 2007 when it all began. I've really enjoyed my time being a peer researcher. My full-time career is as a keynote speaker on mental health and mental illness and creativity and wellness. I was diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features and anxiety and a couple of other things. So I come from the lived experience portion. And Erin was asking me saying, so what are you going to share? Because I usually talk about that I like to run and I've got a new dog and stuff. And one of the things that I thought I'd share was that I knew at a fairly young age that I wanted to be an actor. And so my background's in acting, and I was an actor for quite a number of years. But what I also wanted to do is I wanted to be Jane Goodall. So I had like a poster of a chimpanzee above my bed. I never had like Leif Garrett or Andy Gibb. I'm like totally dating myself. Anyway, and so I had this chimpanzee poster and whales and loved looking at all the different marine stuff and animals. And so anyway, it didn't work out that way, but it still worked out pretty good.
Was it the primates that you loved, or was it just animals full stop?
Animals.
I mean, what about David Attenborough? Why would you not choose David Attenborough over Jane Goodall?
I know. It was animals in general, but really it was the chimpanzees. Like I just thought, God, yeah.
There you go. That's one thing I didn't know about you. I thought I knew everything about you, and vice versa by this point.
Yeah.
Thank you. How about you, Emma?
Hi everyone, I'm Emma Morton. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of British Columbia. I've been doing research in some shape or form with CREST since I think back in 2015 when I was doing my PhD, and I liked them so much I moved over from Australia to join them here in Canada. I have also in my previous life in Australia worked as a psychologist across a couple of different settings. So the kind of hats I'm bringing to the table today are both the research side of things and also having worked clinically with people around managing depression. And I was thinking of what Victoria said just before about, what don't people know about me? So I might also share what I wanted to do when I was little, which is kind of similar to Victoria. I wanted to be a vet, but I also shared with Erin and Victoria before that I was scared of dogs. So I wanted to be a vet that saw every other animal but dogs.
I also get the impression that you're one of those people, myself included, who just can't bear to see the animals in pain. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of veterinary life that wouldn't be.
I think I ended up finding the outlet for my caring that's a little bit more suited to somebody who's a little bit scared of dogs and big animals.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for sharing those things. Let me give you a little bit of kind of, housekeeping stuff that we run through, and then I want to kind of frame our conversation for our focus today, which is on depression a little bit before we move over to Emma and Victoria. There are probably some people joining us today who haven't been to one of these events before. So these are brought to you by talkBD, which is a Canadian-based network, but really is functioning as an international network at this point, which is dedicated to advancing research and knowledge exchange, focusing specifically on bipolar disorder, and really looking at creating new ways for people with bipolar disorder and their supporters and healthcare providers to get involved in research and healthcare system change in a different way. Some technical stuff, you'll either be joining us today by Zoom or by live stream. Thank you to everybody who's already submitted questions for the Q&A section via our anonymous survey on the talkBD website. If you have questions that come up during the presentation or at the end, you can also give them to us through Zoom by typing into the anonymous Q&A box, or you can submit them from Facebook if that's where you're coming from. There won't be any questions taken by audio though, just so you know. And then one of the other things that we've been doing over the past 2 or 3 weeks is talking to our community about what topics they wanted us to see covered in our talkBD events moving forward. And we heard very clearly from a number of people that depression is either part of your life or on your mind at the moment, or you're really trying to support other people who are experiencing symptoms of depression or depressive episodes. So that's what we chose to focus on for today. And let's begin our time today by talking a little bit around and about depression now during these particular times of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll point you to a couple of resources and documents. One of the more interesting ones that I've come across recently is actually a policy brief that was brought out by the United Nations. I think it was published on May 13th. And it was called The Need for Action on Mental Health. We'll be providing the links to all of the references that we'll be giving for you during this talk at the end of the talk. But that, if you want to really try and take the pulse of what's happening internationally or globally in terms of mental health experiences and COVID-19, that's a reasonable place to start. It really puts out a very well-worded global call for action for the need for a mental health response during these times, and for that to be concerted and systematic across different countries. It also provides some interesting data, such as it is currently, looking at specific populations who are showing high degrees of psychological distress during COVID-19. These include, as you're probably fully aware, frontline healthcare workers, first responders. There's actually some Canadian data that shows that nearly 50% of healthcare workers in Canada have recently reported a need for extra psychological support right now. Other communities of particular interest and concern are women. Women are often bearing a large brunt of the stress in the home right now. And carers more broadly, older adults, children and adolescents, and then vulnerable and marginalized populations. So we know at the general population level that psychological distress, hand in hand with anxiety and depression, are a thing right now. No surprises there. It's interesting when you start to look for really high quality data around depression specifically. Because that's still yet to come out. In order to really fully ascertain the relationship between depression and stresses in COVID-19, we're going to need long-term data, longitudinal data. And you've certainly will have seen that many, many research studies are being launched right now. A lot of them supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research here in Canada, but many funding agencies are supporting some phenomenal work, but the data really isn't coming in yet or available for us to look at or tease apart the relationship between depression over time. So we're going to have to wait for some of that. There are a couple of interesting smaller scale studies that are available though. There's a group called the Mental Health Research Canada. They launched a longitudinal study in early April, and they were one of the first groups to release any data that was Canadian centric on depression rates currently. They surveyed about 1,800 people during the last week of April across all our provinces and territories in Canada. And it's cross-sectional, so you have to sort of look at what you can do with cross-sectional data versus long-term data. But it did indicate that about double the number of people surveyed as would be normally expected were reporting that they were experiencing high rates of depression right now, and even higher rates in people with a prior history of depression. Let's also contextualize this in relationship to bipolar disorder a little bit. And I think I don't know about you, Victoria and Emma, but one of the things I think about when I think about not so much a myth, but some of the misunderstandings about bipolar disorder, particularly in people who don't live with the condition or aren't fully versed in it, is that it's all about the mania. It's all about the elevated mood states, the hypermania. That's what we see most of in the media. And it's really, mania is a terrible mood state to experience. It is often associated with hospitalization and can come hand in hand with a lot of problems. But it's important to know that for many people, the fabric of bipolar disorder, the bread and butter mood condition that people experience in bipolar disorder is depression. Depressive symptoms and episodes are 3 or 4 times more likely to occur than elevated mood states. Depression is the main driver of disability and functioning problems and impact of quality of life in people with the condition. And it's a really important thing to know. In fact, Emma, you did a review of quality of life in this field, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's starting to be a really large body of evidence which says that depression is probably one of the biggest predictors of quality of life for people living with bipolar disorder. Pretty unsurprisingly, people tend to feel worse about their quality of life in general when they're experiencing both a major depressive episode, but also when people are experiencing those sub-threshold symptoms of depression that can be really persistent and protracted for people with bipolar disorder. So that's one of the things that causes that long-term problems with how well you feel you're doing in your work, your relationships, even physical health. So it has pretty pervasive impacts.
Thanks for that. So, ready to get into it? Should I pass over to you, Emma?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So in some of our previous talkBD sessions, we've looked at some of what we might call preventative or maintenance strategies for bipolar disorder, things like watching for early warning signs, making sure you maintain a regular sleep-wake schedule, and avoiding things that make your mood worse, like substances. But the strategy that I'm going to be talking about today is something that we have the most evidence for when people are in an acute period of depression. So where different strategies and those kind of prevention or additional strategies to those preventative techniques might be needed. So it's called behavioural activation, and it's part of a complement of techniques known as cognitive behaviour therapy. And they aim to break the cycle of lethargy and negative thoughts and behaviours that maintain depression. So for people who have been depressed or live with somebody who's experienced depression, you'll be very well familiar with the fact that one of the really defining and limiting and distressing symptoms of depression is a loss of interest and enjoyment in your usual activities. And when that's combined with the fatigue and lack of energy that's also really common in depression, unfortunately people's worlds start to get really small. Start to do less, socialize less, and the activities that we do feel up to doing are things that are quite passive, like watching a lot of television. And I want to emphasize here that this is really an understandable and intuitive behavioral change to make. It does feel sensible and protective in some ways to isolate ourselves from things that are stressful or upsetting in our environment. And obviously, resting seems like a really intuitive thing to do when you lack energy. But unfortunately for people who are vulnerable to clinical depression, over the long run, this kind of rest and recovery behavior actually counterintuitively maintains rather than helps depressed mood. And the reason for that is that as you become more withdrawn and isolated from your environment, you're no longer experiencing the positive events that might give your mood a foothold to start shifting and changing in a positive direction. People also end up with all this time for negative self-talk and rumination and very little to distract themselves from those thought patterns. And people can put off tasks for work or study or things around the house, and then risk becoming overwhelmed by this accumulating pile of responsibilities, and that potentially cues those patterns of negative self-talk that says, I'm hopeless, I'm not keeping up with things. And finally, it does keep you isolated from sources of social support and prevents you getting feedback from the environment that might challenge some of those negative beliefs, like that people don't want to spend time with you or enjoy your company. So it's this really insidious cycle that maintains that low mood. And for many people right now, the changes with COVID-19 have activated this cycle. It's separated them from lots of their usual activities. So both for people with a pre-existing vulnerability to depression, like bipolar disorder, but also like Erin talked about, those other vulnerable groups might be experiencing this behavioral change right now. So where behavioral activation aims to counter this cycle is by gradually increasing the amount of activity that you engage in, and particularly these two types of activity. Things that bring you some kind of enjoyment or pleasure, and then activities that bring you a sense of mastery or accomplishment. I feel like I've achieved something, I've done something productive today. And by increasing gradually your level of activity, you give your mood more opportunities to be lifted, either through directly feeling good about what you're doing, or getting that distraction, like I said, from those negative thoughts that can worsen mood. I can put you in situations that challenge some of those negative thought patterns that you have about either yourself or the environment, like slowly getting on top of your household management gives you some pretty good objective evidence to counter the belief that I'm hopeless and I can't do anything. Or spending time with family and friends can help you challenge the belief that others don't like you or don't want to spend time in your company. And in I think our last talkBD session, Professor Greg Murray also talked a bit about how this can stabilize your sleep-wake cycles as well. So I won't get too much into detail about that, but that's another way that it can increase your energy and help your mood. So while it kind of can feel really counterintuitive to do these things when you feel fatigued and want to rest, this does help break that cycle of lethargy, and gradually it can be really helpful for lifting mood and energy levels.
Emma, I was just going to say, sort of from my experience before you get into sort of the how-to things, I recently went into a really severe reoccurrence of depression and anxiety, and I really echo that concept, or not even concept, but the evidence that for me anyway, the majority of my mood states have been struggling and protecting myself against the onset of depression. Mania, as much as it is disruptive, it's, like you said, Erin, very minimal compared to the amount of times that I've been depressed and the amount of work that I actually need to do to prevent it from coming back. And so I feel like I'm more familiar with depression and that vicious cycle, which is so, I wish it wasn't so counterintuitive, because the time when I have the least amount of energy, the least amount of motivation, the most self-hatred, to be honest, the lowest sense of self-esteem, identity, all those things, is the time when I really need to find ways to get moving. And so I know that some of the things you're going to share is how to set some goals that are like really realistic and attainable, because the worst thing when I first started looking at this is being able to set a goal, knowing that I should do it, and finding that the goal I set was just unrealistic. I didn't do it at all. And then it just perpetuates that self-talk, which perpetuates self-isolation. And of course, it just goes on. So and this is where I feel like the network of friends and my loved ones and health providers have really helped by reminding me that how important it is. And one of the things I think was most important for me was also to know that when I started to do these small activities, I needed to let go of the expectation of actually feeling better right away. It was an accumulation of positive actions that actually started to lift my mood. And I get these little blips of joy, or little blips of maybe not even joy, but of relief, or when the world felt a little brighter as opposed to the black and white that it did. And so I can say after, I guess it was probably 4 or 6 weeks of quite severe depression, that I'm probably 85% out of it and sort of on the road to recovery, but I'm still sort of, I'm having to be on top of it a lot more. And those activities, besides just being a distraction, also just allowed time to pass. So for virtue of just, being able to sort of just put one foot in front of the other, gave me something to do other than just watch Netflix, which, is an enjoyable thing, but not always that productive. Anyway, I just wanted to pop in that.
I really like what you said there about the accumulation of little blips of relief or good feeling, because I do want to validate that for many people this kind of sounds like a little bit boring and overly simplistic, and often really pushes that button that reminds them of well-meaning family members kind of saying, just go for a walk, and expecting that to, fix depression. Like,
That's right.
thanks, I'm cured,
But
that's, yeah, that's not exactly what we're saying here. It's not a cure-all, but when paired with this CBT package of techniques, it is a powerful tool that interrupts that depressive cycle. It is effortful, and like Victoria said, it can be a little bit of just a slow, long walk to get through that period, but those little blips of relief, they do really add up in a powerful way. So how do you actually get started doing this? The basic principle is to pick some activities that are enjoyable and activities that give you that sense of accomplishment, and schedule them in ahead of time, whether that's by putting notes in your calendar, or using a worksheet. Like in the list of resources that we've shared in the chat, there's a really nice package of worksheets from a place in Australia that kind of you can use to start planning ahead and brainstorming activities. And doing the scheduling ahead of time helps in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's like making a little bit of a commitment or agreement to yourself that this is something that I am going to give a go, and that can be sometimes the cue that you need to get moving when it does feel so hard and so heavy. Secondly, having your activities planned out to a degree can be really helpful if you're one of the many people who has trouble concentrating or making decisions when depressed. You don't have to think of something to do on the spot. You can refer back to your plan. And lastly, the kind of pre-planned balance is also a good strategy specifically for people with bipolar disorder, who might be more vulnerable to, as they start to feel better, taking on more and more energizing and goal-directed activities. So it's useful to have that plan to refer back to say, is this a good balance for me, or am I on a little bit too much right now and I'm a little bit more vulnerable? So I'm going to kind of run through quickly a couple of the common challenges, and Victoria, feel free to chime in anytime if you've got experience working through those. The first one, the major one, obviously, is if I don't have any energy, how do I even get started? And I think we've been trying to be really authentic about this and not sugarcoating it, that it is going to feel like pushing a car out of mud at first. You are overcoming so much depressive inertia, and it is going to be effortful. But, what I'd like to offer is that once you do start moving, like once you get that car rolling, it is much easier to maintain that momentum. So what can be helpful is starting a bit simple at first. You know, you don't have to plan all 24 hours of the day. You can pick a morning, afternoon, evening activity and think, what level is going to be workable for me right now? You know, instead of getting a little bit over ambitious and saying, I'm going to clean the entire kitchen this afternoon, just pick one drawer. That's enough. That's enough sometimes to give you that little bit of a boost and sense of accomplishment.
Yeah,
and in that packet of worksheets.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that in the very beginning, I picked just 2 things in a day to do. So one was more about enjoyment, and the second one was something that was more of a responsibility. And it was as small as emptying the dishwasher. To do more than that, it just didn't make sense to me in my head. So so I was able to do that. And also the I guess the frustrating thing is that when my counselor actually said, well, remember, try to put something that you can look forward to. And I'm going, I'm depressed and I'm not looking forward to anything. And she clarified, and we talked about that it's, well, what did I used to look forward to? And so being able, and the interesting thing I found was also that ability to plan or schedule it. So one of those things was reading a good book that I had, is that I could look forward to it. And so actually thinking about it gave me a sense of comfort and relief, like the burden of the day was actually going to be over at a certain point, and I was going to be able to have this little 20 minutes of, I've scheduled to do this. Or if it was Netflix, I was sort of allowed to do it as opposed to my default. And that really, really helped, actually, both on a just maintaining my momentum through the day, and then also actually doing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, that even if you're just picking 1 or 2 activities to get started, that gives you something on the horizon to think about, to hopefully anticipate in a good way, and to know that at least there's some kind of anchor to structure your day around. For people who are having a little bit of trouble remembering what it is that they liked to do in the past, or not kind of sure what level of activity is right for them, there's a lot of useful, like a box of activities, lists of things that often have been generated by peers, people who have lived with bipolar disorder or depression, just various things to kind of kickstart your brainstorming. And some people find it helpful to kind of structure that list of activities in order of what's easy for me and accomplishment for me right now, and what's something that I might like to work towards, to have a little ladder where you can really start to see some progress. The other thing that kind of comes up commonly as a challenge, obviously for depression, is those unhelpful thinking styles that maintain that negative mood are going to make it really challenging to get benefit sometime out of doing behavioural activation. So things like predicting the future and assuming that this isn't going to work, so why bother? Discounting the positive is a big one. You know, I only clean 1 drawer, so why should I be proud of that? Not realizing that that's an accomplishment right now. Or black and white thinking, you know, if I don't feel 100% back to normal, it isn't working, instead of looking for and noticing and feeling good about those little blips of relief that Victoria talked about. So one way that I would recommend challenging this style of thinking is to treat behavioural activation like a science experiment, and just get that data so you can, you know, sometimes we call it like being a lawyer against your brain. You're coming in with the evidence and saying, no, I've got it right here on the paper that, you know, my mood was here right before I did this activity, and now it's at, you know, a 5 or a 6, which is better for me. So you can rate your mood, your sense of pleasure, and your achievement before and after trying out these activities, and that's going to give you a sense of, over a long period of time, is this actually overall working for me? But also which activities in particular are working for me. Maybe it's physical activity. When I move my body, I start to feel better. Maybe it's connecting with family and friends. So you get to get a sense of what's most effective for my situation. And there are worksheets in the resources, but nowadays there's also apps which can help with that, which I think Victoria might have given a try recently.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want me to speak about that now, or wait till we can talk about it at the end?
I mean, I'm happy to just get a brief sense of
Yeah.
how that was like to kind of notice those trends.
Yeah, so I've been using Dailyo, and I've tried eMoods as well, and they're really simple. It's actually it works on two levels where it has sort of a chance where you can sort of say what your mood state is when you're doing the entry and what you're doing at the same time. And so it gives some really good data. It sort of challenges that sort of thinking. And then it's also a way of seeing, oh, I actually did do a lot. Did this and did that and all these things. So I've found it really intuitive and really easy to use as well. So it's been helpful, and it's sort of a fun way to do it. It's not specific for illness or bipolar disorder, but it's been helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whether it's being a scientist or being a lawyer, it's quite a satisfying feeling for many people once you start to get that evidence piling up to be able to challenge that negative filter that comes along. And obviously we need to acknowledge that there's a challenge that's very specific to this time, which is that with physical distancing and for many people changes to their usual patterns of going to school or being at work, we might need many of our usual activities are off the table. And like I said earlier, for a lot of people that has really kickstarted that negative cycle. So there is a kind of need to adapt, and many people are working their way through this challenge, having some successes, having some things that aren't working, but trying to be creative and flexible in how we adapt our usual activities to this time.
I know.
I think
Sorry, I was just going to say, because I know one of the things that I leaned heavily on was support my social network. And because of COVID, it shifted everything. So you can't go for a cup of coffee with a friend. It might be, eventually we were able to go for walks and things. So some of it really became about sort of bookending activities, so that if I wanted to do something, whether it was the enjoyable activity or a more chore-like one, it was calling a friend, just like a lifeline on the game show, saying, hey, this is what I'm about to do, but I'm not up for it. And then getting a little bit of cheerleading from that person, and then doing whatever I could, and then checking in with them at the end and saying how it went and how I felt. And so it gave me a chance to experiment, but also use social support when I was having difficulty even doing one task a day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the key is, like you said, thinking about, well, what was helpful to me at that time, both in terms of the type of activity that I was doing, what kind of need was that meeting for me, whether it's physical activity, exercising, socialization. And one of the little things along the way that actually helped me get there is that somebody who was kind of giving that cheerleading, like, for me, it's harder to do exercise when I'm not in a kind of social, have some of those external motivators. So maybe you want to schedule, a little Zoom workout with friends. Maybe it's that you could kind of do that when you had a little reward after, like, going and getting a coffee. So giving yourself that promised reward for doing that same activity in a kind of different format. So there is, again, in the list of resources, a bunch of suggested alternatives for common behavioural activation goals that can hopefully kickstart that brainstorming for people.
That's a really handy resource that you found there, Emma. I'm excited to share that one. We have lots of questions coming in.
All right.
Are you guys ready to get yes, please? I think this one might be aimed at you primarily, Victoria. My friend's daughter is a musician whose European and American tours were cancelled due to COVID. and they are super anxious and depressed. Do you have any advice? Because you're a presenter actress. You must be facing similar issues.
I am. And in 1 week, my whole calendar was, shut down, more or less. And so I leaned really heavily on all the tools that I know I needed. I still went into a depression, and then I continued to lean on those tools. And the most important one was really movement. For me, it was running. And because I run on a fairly regular basis, and my husband knows how good it works for me, he was really my cheerleader. So we would often go for a walk in the woods. I would get my running togs on, and we'd take the dog, and I would run back and forth while he was running and walking to catch up. And so that was, at that point, it was almost the only way that I would do it, is with someone that way. And what was also important to me was, because that creative outlet was gone, and the performance part was so important for my well-being. It was really a wellness tool. Is I found ways to incorporate it. So I ended up scheduling a half-an-hour writing session with a really good friend of mine, who I felt really safe with, so that even though my writing might felt, because I was still really depressed and I didn't feel like I was accomplishing much at the time, he really he's one of my most compassionate friends, and so really role modeled that. And those were some of those were the two tools. And then other than that, also looking ahead and really knowing, visioning in a year from now, things will be different. So not having that sort of catastrophizing perspective. So using some CBT tools. I hope
this
that
too shall pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would also just want to validate, that this is, it sounds like a grieving process, like for many of us, that we've lost things during this time. Obviously, there's the significant, really tragic loss of human life, but people have goals and valued parts of their identity that they can't express in this period, and it can be helpful to take a compassionate lens and say, I'm grieving that, and that's okay, and it's going to take me a little bit of time to process that, and just be gentle with yourself during that period.
But beyond that too, finances, loss of money is a huge factor. Right now, we should probably do one of these events on that very topic in the future, because it's a difficult one to work around. Okay, next question is interesting. Can you push yourself too hard to get out of a depression? Everyone I talk to says you need to exercise, see friends, socialize, but I feel like pushing myself to do all of that just makes it worse. Isn't it better just to wait it out and be patient?
I think this is really where that ladder of that hierarchy of activities, and really starting slowly and gently at first, is important, because it's so important not to overextend and give yourself a really negative experience of doing this, and taking on too much and feeding into that negative thought machine that says, aha, now you've shown me that you can't do it, you're hopeless, and all of those other things that our brain is just so very good at saying, unfortunately. So while it is really intuitive and important to balance those steps out of your comfort zone with those kind of soothing and restful activities, it is important to kind of think about what's every day is a little step forward that I can do. How can I gradually build this up in a way that's comfortable for me?
Yeah, and I would say that what was really important for me when I'm doing this is adjusting my expectations. So initially, that depressive thinking comes back and says, "Oh, this is so insignificant," and bringing compassion to give me enough wiggle room, self-compassion to say, "Yeah, right now it is. Right now, going for a walk to pick up the mail is what I need to do." And then at the same time, what you were saying is gently and wisely increase the difficulty just a little bit. So I'm challenging myself, but really setting myself up for experiences of success, because that's what helps the most. And when I can't be self-compassionate, that's why I talk to a counselor, or I talk to a friend, or I talk to my husband, or get, licked by my puppy to realize, oh, right, okay, so someone seems to love me no matter what, even if I don't.
Yeah. And of course, like I said, taking that lens of being a scientist, like Erin and I know, obviously we try to set up our experiments in a way that we think is going to work out, but sometimes they don't. And that just gives us some material to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, that mix of ingredients didn't work for me. How can I learn from this and change it up next time?
Nice answers. Thank you. Next one asks, as somebody who's dealing with depression in general through COVID, I'd appreciate some advice on how to explain how I'm feeling to a friend. I'm worried that they'll think I'm always just down or sad. It's coming via Zoom.
Yes, I think I've actually heard some people saying anecdotally that during this period, it's actually been a little bit easier to talk about my mental health, because now other friends and family members are getting a taste of the kind of crushing anxiety and depression that I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So it actually kind of, for some people, is giving a little bit of a window of opportunity to say, hey, you know how you're feeling right now? That's been something that's going on for me too. It's really hard to have that vulnerability. Obviously, there's an element of choosing carefully who in your life is that has generally been sensitive and compassionate. But there's also, that element of trust and knowing that, not everyone's going to respond to you in the same way that, again, that depressed brain wants you to believe that they will. Sometimes that leap of faith can be a pretty important step to take.
Yeah, and I really relate to that feeling that other people are just going to go, oh my God, is she still sad? Is she still down? And, that this is who I am. And I think part of it is, I think what you said, Emma, is true, is that people are understanding this sort of low-level, low-grade anxiety that people have, that probably many people are waking up with, regardless of whether they have an anxiety disorder or not. And so it gives an idea of how it is, despite what we want to do and when we want to look on the bright side or whatever. It gives people a little bit more empathy, and also just understanding that I think this is where this psychoeducation really helps, is understanding that with these times, like I recognize that the reason I was in this depression was it was multiple reasons. And so describing what it feels like, but also describing some of the reasons. It's not necessarily factors of loss that could be part of it, but it's also my genetic vulnerability. It's the trauma that I experienced when I was a kid. And so unlike someone who has maybe an ulcer, when they get stressed, the ulcer acts up, my depression comes up and comes forward. And also knowing, depending on who you're talking to, knowing that they've seen you at other times when you have been happy and more yourself. So.
Yeah, I agree with what you said about having that unstigmatizing, hopeful information, evidence-based information to share with people, particularly if this person is somebody who, might be a really important support in your life, and it's really necessary for them to understand what you're going through. When we were evaluating our bipolar wellness center, I heard a lot of people saying that, this has been really good to show my family and friends this accurate but also hopeful depiction of what it's like to live with bipolar disorder, rather than just turning them loose on Google and, coming up with who knows what.
Just don't do it. Just don't go to
Sorry,
Google. I like this next question because it's about the relationship between anxiety and depression. This person says, I find certain tasks related to my schoolwork triggers my anxiety, which causes me to procrastinate and then isolate myself, leading me to feel depressed. It really talks about that chain, the way anxiety and depression can feed each other.
Mm-hmm.
How can I motivate or get a sense of confidence when I'm feeling low and depressed like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anxiety and depression are really, from what we know in research, really strongly comorbid, or they occur together for probably the vast majority of people who have bipolar disorder and just unipolar depression. I probably should have discussed that element in the cycle of lethargy is also the little anxious, worrying thoughts feeding in there as well, like because obviously that's a real challenge to overcome when you are scheduling some of these activities. The thoughts of what if I fail? What if people see that I'm no good at this? All of those things. And so I think that's when it's particularly helpful to lean on not just the behavioural side of CBT, but that cognitive side. So coming up with some ways to challenge those thoughts that come up with, again, bringing out that little mental lawyer, thinking about experiences in the past, or coming up with alternative thoughts that that might be more helpful in managing your mood. And there's that, as part of that package that has been shared, they also kind of cover in more detail than we went into today, those common kinds of unhelpful thoughts and some tips on addressing those.
Yeah, and I certainly relate. I mean, when I was in this phase of quite severe depression, it came along with severe anxiety. And the two things that helped me was something that I just recently was learning about for tolerance of uncertainty, is looking at my relationship to what feels threatening and having it based on probability, not possibility. So looking at the past. So similar to this experiment. So when I was approaching my work, out of proportion, totally intimidated by it, which was not typically what I usually am. So being able to actually go, okay, so in the past, when I've studied enough or when I've prepared enough, how has it actually worked out? Okay, it's sort of worked out. And it usually helps, I get to recognize that it's an anxious mind kind of thinking. And then literally being able to set a timer and saying, I'm going to commit 15 minutes to doing what I'm scared of. And doing whatever part that is. And then I could do whatever I wanted for the rest, like for another hour and a half, go watch my show. And eventually, often I found that it was easier than I thought, and the anxiety decreased. The depression didn't always go away, but the anxiety did a bit. And it was a way of sort of intervening and breaking that cycle.
We're going to need to press on, and I hate this when we get more questions that we're going to be able to address. So I'm sorry for people on the line. We'll try and follow up through the ones with social media afterwards that we can't get to today. This is a pragmatic one, though. It's a great question. I think it begins with you, Emma. It's I love this idea of scheduling activities in slots through the day. But what are some strategies to really help that negative feedback pattern that happens when you don't get any of them done? I can identify with them. You schedule in, you have the best intentions, you do all the pre-work, but it still doesn't happen.
Yeah, that is a really common experience, and part of, I guess, setting yourself up for success is having some kind of self-soothing and self-compassionate perspective where you can say, you know what, like, it makes sense that I wasn't able to do this. I'm really depressed right now, and what I have done is I had this intention. I set out a plan. That's more than I was doing at this point in time last week, perhaps. Validate that initial step forward, and maybe that's the activity that you were able to take a step forward with, was just getting the plan done. And it's being gentle with yourself around those setbacks, because recovery is not just a straight line. It is a hill, and sometimes it'll feel easier, and sometimes you'll realize, oh, I've gone back down a little bit, and I just need to be compassionate with myself as I continue along that path.
That's a good response. I wanted to just read this one out. This is so interesting. This is the third time we've done one of these events where somebody has made a comment like this. And it's about not depression right now, but depression when things go back to the way they were pre-COVID. So this person says, I feel better during these times, less abnormal. I don't feel so sad and alone and left behind when I'm not just the only person at home. I feel depressed when I think about things returning to normal and when things reopen. How do I prepare for this?
I think that's kind of a common experience right now, is to start feeling a little bit of anxiety creeping up, or the kind of like preemptive depression, thinking about how challenging and stressful perhaps going back into routines of work or school, or perhaps things that were constantly exposing you to quite stressful situations. It's really natural to wonder, how am I going to be able to cope with all this, and am I going to be able to cope with all this, along with naturally that anxiety of still being in the midst of a global pandemic that we're not quite sure about.
This person's talking about loss as well, the loss of the relationships and the contacts that they have now that they wouldn't normally have during COVID times. It's another interesting form of loss. Go on.
Yeah, I think this is also a learning experience, that something really, it's okay if something good came out of this for you, that doesn't make you selfish to have enjoyed that and want that to continue in some way, shape or form. And potentially it's thinking about, well, now I've had the experience of realizing this is really important and supports my mental health in a really good way, to have this level of social contact, and maybe just having an open discussion with people about, hey, I actually found this part really good. How can we keep that going? Take that, the flexibility and creativity that you've been able to apply to this situation, to having some really good relationships and social contact in a time when a lot of people are really struggling, and think, how can we keep that going in the future?
Nice. Anything to add to that, Victoria, before we get into a few resources and tools?
No, I think just I like that idea of like looking at what this circumstances, what needs it has it fulfilled, and being able to see maybe those were gaps pre-COVID, and so it's giving you some information, which I think is really valuable. And also learning, for me, it's been a process of acceptance. So not only the acceptance of my sadness or my grief, but acceptance of the change that's going to come, that has come. And so mindfulness has been a real, mindfulness techniques and practices has been a really important thing that bring in that self-compassion. So I don't think you're alone in feeling apprehensive about what's going to come. And though in the past, I think if we've survived up until now, we'll continue to survive and be able to find ways of working it out in the future.
And also maybe keep a grip on some of the positive legacy that people have experienced during times like this, when communities have come together in different ways. Great. Okay, let's move into giving you a few resources and tools from today. So we'll move over to showing some slides. As we mentioned, we put together a document that will be shared at the end of this, where you've actually, I see if you're on Zoom, you've already had it shared during the chat. You'll have it shared again at the end, and it will be available through our website afterwards. It lists a lot of, or all of the resources that we've worked through today, and the PDFs and stuff that you can access for those, including, for example, the behavioural activation worksheet that Emma talked about, and also links to a couple of the apps that we've seen are being used quite frequently by people with bipolar disorder to measure their moods over time. The reason that we know these apps are being used quite a lot right now is because of the survey that we're doing. You may have heard of this already, but if you haven't, to inform our Bipolar Bridges study, we're doing a big international survey of what digital tools people with bipolar disorder are using and what their healthcare providers are recommending to them. We have about 160 people who live with bipolar disorder who've completed that now, but we're still looking to hear more, so please check that out if you haven't already. And our quality of life tool, which we've mentioned before, does have a section in it that measures mood over time and allows you to share results of that with your clinicians or healthcare providers or family members. And then on our academic website, you'll find things such as our Crest Currents, which is where you sign up for our newsletters, stay in touch with all of our different research activities, as well as our events like this one. And our blogs. We've been blogging quite a lot on COVID-related issues. This is last week's blog, which is by Natasha. She's working on the front line of healthcare in the downtown east side, mostly of Vancouver, hand in hand with bipolar disorder. And this is a beautiful blog that reflects on how she's looking after herself and other people amidst this. And also through our Crest site, you'll find links to our previous and upcoming talkBD live events. You can also access those through our Facebook page. And just to mention that our next one will be on June 17th, and it has Lisa O'Donnell, who's an assistant professor in social work. She's really a leading expert on the relationship between work and bipolar disorder. We figured it was a good time to start talking about reintegration into work, re-entry, new jobs, loss of jobs. So that one will be at 4 o'clock Pacific time in Vancouver, 7 o'clock Eastern in Canada, or bright and early at 9 a.m. if you're joining us from Australia. Right? And then finally, at the end of this meeting, you will see a little survey. It's like 3 or 4 questions pop up, just asking your opinion on whether you like what we're doing, what topics you would like to see us cover, and you can access that through our Facebook page and website too. Now, I did see that there was a question that came up on the Zoom chat about supporting a teenager who's out in the community and is experiencing suicidal ideation or problems right now. Our go-to resource for online or sort of text-based help for suicide is on suicide.org. This was a site that was created by the late Sandra Dawson, who died from cancer a couple of years ago. Fabulous advocate and a really rich resource, which is international, providing credible resources for suicide prevention and support. So I then encourage that participant who asked that question to check this out. And just a shout out to our funders and partners who make our work possible, including this talkBD series. And I think that's my last slide, just to tell you where to go for more information. So with that, we will just pass back to our speakers, just have a minute or so for any closing words. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise today. This was, you know, it's not the most easy topic to talk about, depression, it's critical. I really liked the way you blended some really kind of pragmatic, compassionate, in the moment, experimental, curious, keep trying if it doesn't go right, and judge the evidence kind of strategies today. I learned some stuff for sure.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I would just want to leave with, you know, anyone that's in the thick of it right now. One of the things that my depressed brain usually tells me is that this is the one that I will never get out of, or it'll only get to a certain point. And so far that has never happened. So just from me to you, know that the tunnel may feel like it's a long, long tunnel, but you will get out to the other side. I know that.
There's no better place to end with, I think, than those words. Stay well, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.